Thank you for tuning in. Our program will begin in just a moment. Thank you for tuning in. Our program will begin in just a moment. Good day. Welcome to Advocacy Anywhere, powered by American Jewish Committee. Advocacy Anywhere is AJC's digital platform that enables you to engage with AJC's global expertise, content, and advocacy from wherever you are. Amid rising tensions with Iran, recognition that the U.S. Saudi relationship needs to be reset, deepening Israeli-Palestinian distrust, and the ever-changing Israeli political landscape, President Biden will soon be making his first visit as president to the Middle East. Joining us today to analyze what we can expect from this trip and what it means going forward are Kirsten Fontenrose, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council and U.S. National Security Council Senior Director in 2018, Dr. Eran Lerman, Vice President of the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security and Deputy Director of the Israeli National Security Council from 2009 to 2015, and Dr. Omar Al-Ubaydli, Director of Research at the Bahrain Center for Strategic, International, and Energy Studies. Moderating today's conversation is AJC Chief Policy and Political Affairs Officer Jason Isaacson. After we hear from our esteemed guests, we will take your questions. You may email your question to questions@ajc.org, questions is plural, or you can use the Q&A feature in Zoom. Jason, the floor is yours.
Claire, thanks very much. And thank you. And thank you to our AJC Advocacy Anywhere audience and to our distinguished panelists joining us from the United States, from Israel, and from the Kingdom of Bahrain. In his 18th month in office, Joe Biden will take his first trip to the Middle East next month as president, 2 weeks after back-to-back summits of the G7 in the Bavarian Alps and of NATO leaders in Madrid. He'll face a range of challenges, including ongoing security threats to American allies in the region posed by Iran and its proxies, energy, economic, food security, and strategic assumptions skewed by the Russian war in Ukraine, persistent questions about America's commitment to retain a powerful presence in the Middle East, not yet resolved tensions with Saudi Arabia, and as of a few days ago, the collapse of the current Israeli governing coalition, all of which provides our panel multiple opportunities to offer informed insights, each from a specific and seasoned perspective. I'm going to pose a series of questions to these policy experts, and later this hour, we'll open it up for questions from viewers. First, allow me to thank our panelists again for joining AJC Advocacy Anywhere today. Now, Eran, let me begin with you, pose the first question. The president is planning to visit Israel a month after the collapse of the current governing coalition. Does that diminish in any way the impact of the visit, the scope and endurance of the mutual commitments reached between Washington and Jerusalem in the course of that visit?
Overall, it does limit the ability of the president to push for major new policy initiatives with the caretaker government that apparently would be led by then by the presently alternate Prime Minister Yair Lapid, who will be taking over for the first time in his life as Prime Minister of Israel. Clearly, a government that faces elections in late October or early November will be in no position to make major new initiatives, for example, on the Palestinian question. But then this wasn't in the cards anyway, because of the unique nature of this government, which spread from the right to the left on the Israeli political spectrum. Even if it was in place, there would have been a very limited scope for such new initiatives. There will be work done, I believe, with Lapid and Defense Minister Gantz on making the lives of Palestinians better, conditional upon containing the wave of terrorism that we experienced early last month and has more or less been effectively repulsed. But there will not be major new breakthroughs. On the other hand, it will be a grand opportunity to reassert the partnership, the strategic commitment to Israel. There's no question about going to Israel at this time because, frankly, you cannot go to Saudi Arabia, and I think the president is obliged to go to Saudi Arabia given what's happening at the pump, to be blunt. But you cannot go to Saudi Arabia, cannot go to the region being who you are. In the case of President Joe Biden, a friend of Israel since his early years as a young senator, you cannot do this without visiting Israel, regardless of the political situation. Moreover, on three major issues, there is no real nuance between this government and whatever other government may come in after the elections. First of all, there's the Iranian question. I've heard a former National Security Advisor, Uzi Dayan, General Uzi Dayan, say there will be only three issues on the table on this visit: Iran, Iran, and Iran. This is the key question, of course, because the talks in Vienna seem to have gone nowhere. The Iranian insistence on delisting the IRGC apparently derailed this very intense diplomatic effort. And we are facing an accelerated Iranian bid for the accumulation of a significant amount of enriched uranium within range of military grade. And all of this makes the situation very fragile and very fraught with important questions which will not wait for the Israeli elections to be dealt with in dialogue at the highest level between Israel and the United States. This is closely related to another matter, which is also being brought forward and increasingly in open references by government officials. I chaired a meeting of our mutual friend Ahmad Sharai with Defense Minister Benny Gantz on Monday, in which he openly spoke about the Middle East Air Defense Treaty Organization. In other words, an instrument of sharing technology, information, early alerts, and capabilities to contend with potential threats, rockets, missiles, drones from Iran and its proxies. And this, I think, is closely related to the dialogue, the U.S. Saudi dialogue, and of course to the emerging regional cooperation in the era of the Abraham Accords and in the era of Israel's accession to the CENTCOM area of responsibility, which has been the case for the last 2 years. Thirdly, there may just be an opportunity for moving ahead also on settling certain Mediterranean questions. And specifically, I am under the very cautious impression. We all know that false starts in Lebanon are almost habitual. But I'm under the impression that Amos Hochstein has made some progress on the two issues which he went to Lebanon to discuss: the supply of gas via Egypt, some of it may actually be from Israeli provenance, basically, to Syria and Lebanon via Jordan, in order to prevent the energetic collapse of Lebanon, which is already teetering at the edge of the abyss. And the second thing is resolving amicably the question of the EEZ delineation between Israel and Lebanon in a manner which will enable both Israel in Karish field, where there's already a platform of Energean in place, and Lebanon, once they submit their blocks to auctions, to benefit from Eastern Mediterranean riches. So on these three issues specifically, the president can help all of us move ahead, regardless of who is in power in Israel.
I understand. Eran, thank you for that comprehensive answer. Actually, you answered a few of my questions all at once. Thank you. But let me turn to you next, Kirsten, and ask about the president's Saudi Arabia agenda. What are his goals in Saudi Arabia? In meetings that AJC has had with Saudi officials, we've gotten a sense of real alienation and frustration. The notion that Washington, at least under current leadership, fails to appreciate the country's strategic value to the United States and its historic friendship, and that Washington's focus on certain human rights issues is misplaced and misinformed in Saudi eyes. Does the president intend to change that impression? And if so, how?
He does intend to change that impression, but he's not going to. I think it could be somewhat a reset of the relationship, but there's no chance that Riyadh will see this as any sort of reinterpretation by Washington of Saudi's value to Washington. Riyadh is interpreting this visit as something that they are owed because the U.S. is coming with so many asks so frequently, but not as if Washington has turned on a dime and change their opinion of how the relationship looks. But I think after midterms, Biden might have a chance to actually do some reinterpretation. Sounds counterintuitive, but I think a lot of what he's been saying to Saudi and a lot of the pariah language has been because he needs to meet the demands of the left of the Democratic Party. After midterms, which everyone expects to go Republican, everybody loses the midterms, it won't just be Biden, then you'll have him able to say to that left faction, I've got to make some compromises. You've got to let me have some gives. For instance, if we're not going to sell weapons to our partners who are fighting a war in Yemen against proxies who attack them every day, you've got to let us continue our support in terms of intel sharing. Or, he'll say, you've got to allow me to make compromises, or you've got to let me designate the Houthis. I think he'll be able to say, you need to let me meet the Republicans halfway, or we're never going to get anything through this Congress. And that may actually let him pursue a more centrist, kind of more flexible foreign policy with regard to Saudi Arabia than he's been able to so far. But I think one of the things that is interpreted in the Gulf is we've got all this new young leadership, and you, Washington, still see us in an early 90s construct where you think we need you more than you need us. And the Gulf just doesn't see it that way anymore, particularly not Saudi Arabia. And we're going with so many asks that that Biden, he's going to hammer home on talking points about human rights, the things that Riyadh is used to hearing and sort of resents now when they don't see the same being said to Turkey or other places where journalists are disappeared, for instance. But because we have so many things we're going to them with this visit on, whether it's support for a Syria policy and keeping Assad at arm's length, ending the war in Yemen, we're making obviously the asks on energy. We're making a bilateral and regional integrated air and missile defense ask. We're still asking them to stay behind the JCPOA. We're asking them for some normalization, baby steps. We have a lot of asks. So he'll bring those talking points about human rights, the kind of Washington line, but he's not going to be able to deliver any ultimatums. And I think for Saudi, while they won't see it as a reinterpretation in Washington, they'll see it as a forced bend that's in their favor.
Will the president's asks get any positive answers on energy or on anything else, as far as you can tell?
I think he's already gotten everything he's going to get, to be completely honest. I think this visit is the promise made when, in exchange for Saudi agreeing to accelerate the OPEC plus production ramp ups that were planned for September and are now taking place this summer instead. So he's already getting the energy ask met. And, that's sort of, you come to Riyadh, we'll accelerate this starting in July, we'll continue in August, way before September. So that ask is already met. We're not going to, in my opinion, we're not going to have any big announcements about energy come out of this visit that haven't already been made. And in terms of the integrated missile defense and the island transfers, Saudi kind of already expects those too. And frankly, no one cares about this island transfer deal except for Saudi and Israel, who are already talking about it. They almost don't even need the US involved. But it's good that the US is. It gives the Biden team a foreign policy win. But we're already sort of counting on that to take place. And I don't think they're going to get the missile defense deal that they're looking for, not because they aren't trying. The US government's been pushing on this for several administrations in a row now. And it's been on us, it's been on them that this has gone slowly. But on Saudi's part, they don't want to pay for a program that they see being exorbitantly expensive. They want to know what skin the US is putting in the game. And the answer is, Saudi, since you are the largest territorial mass, you're putting in most of it. Saudis don't like that. And then in terms of the regional ask, at the GCC meeting, the UAE doesn't think the US is coming through enough. Again, what skin are you putting in the game? Kuwait won't do it with anything with Israel in that sense without movement on the Palestine issue. Qatar, it's both. You can't have Israelis sitting in Qatar, obviously, and we also don't trust our neighbors. And Oman says, absolutely not. We don't trust our neighbors. So you're going to have, we're going to go with an offer of kind of this tiered hub and spoke opt-in plan. But what it's going to look like is UAE, Bahrain, and Israel with the US and some sort of missile defense, maybe Saudi quietly. They probably want it, but obviously can't bring in Iron Beam and put it in the middle of Saudi Arabia, but they want it and put it in the desert or out in the Neom. It's going to be a harder sell, but you're not going to get this region-wide integrated air and missile defense that the administration and several administrations, it's not a Biden failure in any way. It's simply a goal the US has had for a long time is not going to be met just because of this GCC visit. Iraq hasn't even been brought into the conversations, as far as I understand from Iraqi counterparts, and Egypt and Jordan haven't been invited to that piece also. I don't think we're going to see a big security architecture discussion. It'll just be limited to missile defense for now.
Really interesting. Thanks a lot, Kirsten. Dr. Omar, let me turn to you. From your vantage point in Bahrain, where the United States Navy's Fifth Fleet is based, allow me to ask the following. In the Trump administration and now in the Biden administration, as we've just been discussing with Kirsten, there have been efforts to introduce or encourage a regional security infrastructure. Something that really wasn't possible, certainly not overtly and comprehensively before the Abraham Accords, as we're hearing from Kirsten, it may also not be quite yet possible now. How achievable is it? And to what degree can we expect progress at the summit that the president is scheduled to have with the GCC states and Egypt and Jordan and Iraq? How does it look from your perspective?
So I agree, first of all, thanks for having me today. I agree with everything that Kirsten said regarding the barriers to the security architecture. I would add also that the different countries, the countries involved have differing perceptions of security threats, which is an additional barrier to the ones she mentioned. A country like Oman or Qatar does not perceive the same security threats in the region as a country like Bahrain or Saudi Arabia, let alone Egypt or Jordan. And that adds to this reality that regardless of the US's intentions, the countries themselves it's going to have a time reaching some sort of consensus. And then you add to that the sort of chronic technical barriers, such as the lack of interoperable defense systems and so on and so forth. But I will slightly differ with Kirsten on whether this is a failure or not for Biden. If the US were to be a credible superpower, then I think it could do a lot in terms of getting the different countries in the region to agree on something. But the US's credibility is shot, and Biden has contributed. I would say the credibility sort of gap started or decline started under Bush, continued under Obama, continued under Trump, and has continued. So Biden's definitely not the only reason for that, but I don't think he's done much to assuage his allies' fears. The reality is that whether you're talking about countries in the Middle East, countries in East Asia, or even Europe, it's quite clear that the US has very little appetite for any sort of military deployment that would be consistent with its playing a role as a sort of strategic defense partner. And as a consequence, the countries that it's trying to court are looking for alternatives.
Even though the United States has a substantial naval presence in your country, even though the United States has a substantial air presence in Qatar, we have the combined maritime forces that the United States commands, operating in the Red Sea, operating in the Gulf of Oman, operating throughout the region. It's not an insignificant military presence. In fact, it's the dominant outside military presence. So how is it that the United States is so disrespected in a way?
So I'd say that there's a distinction between military presence and then military activity. Not to say that I'm, a supporter of, invasions and throwing military weight around. But the reality is that, if you're going to judge, for a long time, these huge deployments have been there. And in the past, most spectacularly in the case of the liberation of Kuwait, those deployments have led to, hard power being deployed in a substantive way. But of late, despite the presence of huge amounts of troops, whether you're talking about the 2019 attack on Kirk in Saudi Arabia, the persistent attacks on ships in Red Sea and in the Arabian Gulf, or the drone attacks in the UAE and Saudi Arabia, it's evident that these this military deployments are to a certain degree more for show than they are for actual usage. And even I believe in the case of Iraq, I mean, the US gets its base is attacked and antagonized, and it doesn't seem to do much about it. So unfortunately, the realization that the US's partners have come to in the region is that it's one thing to have the troops, it's another thing to use them, and there seems to be very little appetite for that.
Thank you, Dr. Omar. Eran, let me come back to you and really pick up on this question of, frankly, Israel's role in the military relationships that it has already started to forge across the region. There's an MOU between Israel and Bahrain, of course, between Israel and Morocco as well, all historic developments. Israel is now part of the CENTCOM area of operation, as you were describing. Responsibility. I'm sorry, I got the term wrong, as you were mentioning before. To what degree is it important for the United States to have this kind of dominant presence, or can the individual countries themselves in the region develop their own ways of defending their interests?
Well, I think we are talking about a gray zone. This is not going to be, we're not going to see ever a return to the dominant American position that made the earth shake in 1991 or even 2003 when the Libyans were scared out of their wits and just gave away their nuclear product for fear of being next, and so on and so forth. That kind of world is no longer coming back. On the other hand, I think it's also at the extreme other end to describe a world in which the region will no longer feel any sense of American presence is again an overstatement. There is a middle ground in which the United States retains a significant presence. In fact, is raising the profile of some of its activities. But Israel plays a major role in, let's say, consolidating a regional group of like-minded nations which look to America for strategic guidance, but take more and more of the day-to-day responsibility for managing the regional challenges on their own shoulders. And Israel is demonstrating this to our partners in the region and to the United States through what has come to be called in Israel the CBW, or MABAM by its Hebrew acronym, the campaign between the wars, or what some people in today's professional language call as gray zone operations. It's not peace. Certainly with Iran, we have no peace. It's not war in the traditional sense, but across a full front from pinpoint operations in Syria to covert action in Iran itself. And normally Israel does not own to any of this, but Israel did own up to abducting and interrogating an IRGC operator on Iranian soil as regards the plans to assassinate Israelis, Americans, and others beyond Iran's borders. So clearly a daring do. There is a story of Mossad reach. And then you have a cyber war, which goes on day in, day out. The Iranians are hitting pretty low in Boston Children's Hospital, for heaven's sake. And the Khadera Hospital, they are aiming for very vulnerable targets. But at the end of the day, there is a cyber war going on. And of course, there is a propaganda war of the first magnitude in which the Iranians every other day are promising us that our days are numbered, that we would be wiped off the face of the earth, and so on and so forth. This has come to a head over an Iranian assassination squad, or more than one, penetrating Turkey, hunting for easy targets, Israeli tourists in their hotels or what. impressively, Israel and Turkey cooperated very closely on foiling this. And I think, at least on this respect, President Biden will be coming onto a very different scene as regards Israeli-Turkish relations than, say, President Obama in 2013, when he was actually the cobbler that patched up a ruined relationship. This is coming into a very different situation in this respect.
With Yair Lapid in Turkey today, I believe.
Yes, he went there, I think, to basically thank Çavuşoğlu and the Turkish government for their cooperation on this particular case. But it's broader than this. I'll give you, there's something I should point out, which I think will color also the atmosphere of the visit. Today, when Erdogan needs the UAE and Saudi Arabia to help keep the lira from complete collapse and to have some semblance of economic stability going into next year's presidential election, he knows that Saudi Arabia and the UAE come in one package with Egypt and Israel. This is not the world we grew up in 10 or 20 years ago, 5 years ago. This is a world in which, in order to make nice with the UAE and even MBS, and he did, make quite an effort to be nice to MBS, as you can see even in the visuals. You need also to bury the hatchet with Egypt in Libya and be nice to Israel. Just look at what underwhelming response the Turks gave to a full Israeli division training in Cyprus. The good old Erdogan would have gone berserk. This went almost without a murmur. So you get a sense that the president will be coming into a region where Israeli and Arab relations, military cooperation with Egypt, gas exports to Europe, strategic cooperation with key players in the Gulf, a new relationship with Saudi Arabia, sort of coming gradually to be into the light. All of these are game changers.
I also wouldn't undersell the aspect of the important Israel-U.S. relationship and how important it is in Washington and elsewhere in the United States to see a different kind of relationship with Israel in the Turkish context, but in other contexts as well. Kirsten, let me turn to you. Stay on the subject of Iran. Whether or not the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action is restored, and there are a lot of questions about whether the negotiations that have taken place in Vienna over the last year are going to go anywhere. Iran will continue to pose a conventional threat to its neighbors across the Gulf, as well as Iraq and Jordan and Egypt, and certainly Israel. And in the foreseeable future, will pose a nuclear or threshold nuclear threat to regional and global security as well. Since the talks to restore the 2015 deal opened last year, observers have been asking about a plan B, a strategy the United States and its partners would pursue if a deal is not reached. But in fact, it seems that there needs to be a plan B to ensure regional security and stability, whether there's a new deal or not. Do you believe that such a plan B exists, and will it be discussed on this trip? And after you've offered your thoughts, I'm really interested in what Dr. Omar and Eran have to say as well. Kirsten?
There was not a plan B until early this year, post the attack on the Abu Dhabi International Airport in early January. And now that plan B is what has already been mentioned, what Eran mentioned, the MEADA, this sort of alliance of air defense that's being proposed to the region. And that's a longstanding US goal, as we already mentioned, and they're kind of repackaging it in a way that, frankly, I think is smart to continue to offer this and try to tailor it a bit. But that is the way that the US government is saying, we want to counter Iran with you, but we don't want to be escalatory toward Iran. We're only willing in this administration to do things that are purely defensive in nature. So this is a safe way to do that. But you will have Saudi Arabia and other Gulf folks pushing for a plan B and really hammering on the need for one. You'll have Saudi Arabia reiterate a request that was made when Prince Khalid bin Salman came to Washington about a month ago for a coalition to counter smuggling of weapons and things like drone components to Iran's proxies. The US does a lot of bilateral work with other countries in this vein already, but Saudi is looking for a coalition with a big mandate, pulling all the partners. They know that they can't lead that because you won't have Oman playing, if for instance, as well. The Qatar might not get on board. If the US is the lead for this, they feel like they'd have a better chance of getting a full Gulf and broader region, maybe even European effort to do more to counter that smuggling. You already mentioned the maritime task forces. We have CTF 150 and 153 that are almost specifically focused on this problem set, but it's US. And so their thought is, give us a coalition, lead it, United States, and this will tell us that you're really interested in countering Iran's activities around the region and not just the nuclear program. The US, of course, is comfortable with this because, again, this is simply defensive. You'll probably get a request from the region to do more that's forward-leaning, more that would keep an offensive threat on the table. But Biden's administration is probably going to be nervous about that. They're going to want to keep the conversation to what has already been proposed.
And additional sanctions as well, you think? Is that possible?
It's possible. It's just, how much more are you going to sanction? And I'm all about sanctions because I feel like in the US arsenal, we have sanctions and we have kinetics and we don't have anything in the middle. So unless people want us to go to war, they better be comfortable with economic warfare, with a sanctions program. And as soon as we find out that the IRGC, for instance, or the Quds Force more specifically, is involved in a sector or in a company, we are sanctioning it. We did it under the Trump administration. Biden's continuing that. There's been no let up on the counterterrorism related sanctions pressure. And we'll always be adding more as Treasury Department, for instance, uncovers more of this kind of activity. The debate is always whether those are effective or not, but since we don't really have a lot else to use, that's kind of where we're limited. You could also see some work on applying international counterterrorism law to specific individuals. So allowing victims of torture and the like who are sitting in the US or sitting in Europe to bring charges in international criminal courts against particular leaders in Tehran. So then you'd be applying that pain point to that person and not the society as a whole. Europe's laws really aren't in place for that yet. They've received some recommendations on what they might need to do. And here, our Congress is kind of looking at things we might be able to tweak to make that an even stronger tool set for us. But right now, yeah, you're right. I mean, it's sanctions and then it's defensive actions, unless we're going kinetic.
And I guess the fact that the administration has been involved in these negotiations over the last year with our European partners perhaps gives us a stronger hand in persuading Europe to go along with us on imposing such additional measures.
You're right. At first we thought that, I think Iran's calculus was that Europe being the middleman in these negotiations would keep Europe on side, would keep Europe's goodwill. Oh, look, America, Tehran's still, they're still at the table. Give them the benefit of the doubt. Keep Israel on a leash. Give them some concessions. But it's actually really frustrated Europe because they've seen that Iran is not willing to yield, that they keep coming up with new requirements. So I think it might have backfired a bit. And I think if there are stronger sanctions, you would find Europe playing. Although we always hit the problem of certain sectors of business and industry that do quite a bit of trade, that they're going to fight it. Congress recently did some specific legislation drafting on countering the drone and missile program, and they're looking at even sanctioning European companies whose German engines, for instance, are used in Iran's drone program. Many of these companies don't know their parts are used, and if you go to them with this, hey, you can be sanctioned, they'll often stop. It's not that they're trying to support Iran's activities, but having that ability to bring those sanctions will make that a faster conversation.
Thank you. Thank you, Kirsten. Dr. Omar, let me come back to you and talk more about the Abraham Accords process. There are constant questions about the expansion of Abraham Accords circle of Arab-Israeli peace. The most redundant question, of course, is what country will come next? There have been signs that Saudi Arabia, as we've been discussing, is making its way in that direction, although those signs often come with a warning that a leap directly to full diplomatic relations will still take time. Can we expect progress next month? And I should point out that yesterday, Assistant Secretary Barbara Leaf, in appearing before the House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on the Middle East, gave some hints that there was a possibility of progress being disclosed in the president's visit next month. Is it your sense that the Biden administration is committed to the kind of diplomatic heavy lifting and horse trading that expanding the circle of peace may require? Do you, in fact, think it will require such heavy lifting, or is the process self-sustaining? What's your sense?
So I think that the Biden administration would like to see the scope of these agreements expanded. And I think that there is potentially appetite for that within the region. Recall that before the Abraham Accords, Prime Minister Netanyahu visited Oman and had publicly met I believe Safaqa Qaboos, or perhaps it was the foreign minister at the time. So I think there are other candidates for this, but I would say that it's important to note that there is a very large, diverse range of reasons why countries would like to engage Israel. If you take the case of, for example, the UAE, my personal opinion is that it's been much more about economic relations and improving the diversity of UAE's economy. From Bahrain's perspective, I think it's much more about security and much more about also cultivating Bahrain's image as a country that promotes religious tolerance. And I think in the case of Morocco, it's quite clear it's a much more instrumental reason for that. And I think that you need to, when you think about expanding, you have to understand that different countries have very different reasons for wanting to extend the olive branch to Israel. I would also add, I'm going to disagree slightly with comments made by Eran and Kirsten earlier regarding oil. I don't think oil is actually part of or energy is part of this visit. I think it's a big red herring. I think that Biden's visit is much more about the Abraham Accords, as you mentioned, and about the security issues that Kirsten and the missile defense and so on and so forth. I think energy is a big red herring. And I think the reason for that is that Biden's screwed up the inflation management pretty badly and screwed up sort of energy prices pretty badly. And I think at this stage, Saudi Arabia is much more useful to, and OPEC in general is much more useful to Biden as a scapegoat for domestic economic problems, which is a sort of an age-old trick when it comes to US domestic policy, than it is as a partner in attempting to regulate energy prices in a way that would be conducive to more electoral successes. So yes, going back to your question, I think energy is a non-issue. I think security is the major issue, and expanding the Abraham Accords is a way that Biden can come back and say, look, I've achieved something. I definitely agree with Kirsten that he's not going to get any more concessions than the ones that he's already gotten, except for maybe something on this Abraham Accord side, if he can, get the interests right.
Dr. Omar, let me stay with you for a moment and get your sense of how popular the Abraham Accords are in those countries that now enjoy full diplomatic relations with Israel and are starting to see some economic activity, maybe not as brisk as some people might have hoped, but it's taking off. I know there have been delegations going back and forth. There are memoranda of understanding. There are some new investments that are being discussed. How is it being received in the business community, among youth in your country? What's your sense of how this is taking hold within the society of Bahrain, but also maybe your neighbors?
So my sense, first of all, I think you're right to draw a distinction between a generational distinction. I think if you talk about people who are 40 and over, or certainly 50 and over, people who either witnessed the Israeli-Arab wars in the 60s and 70s, or people who have a strong religious affinity and solidarity with Palestine, I think there you see a much higher level of antipathy and suspicion towards the Abraham Accords. In the contrast, for the younger generation, and I'm talking about practically everywhere in the Middle East, and I include Israel, I think there's a phenomenon that we're witnessing is a massive decrease in religiosity among the youth, whether we're talking about America, UK, Israel, Bahrain. And it's in the region, it's been particularly accelerated after the Arab Spring, where, religious groups were, forwarded themselves as being part of some sort of political development and improvement in the Middle East, but then were exposed as being, hardly a savory alternative to the existing alternatives. And as a consequence, young people just are not as religious as they used to be. And in reality is that in the past, one of the major barriers to Israeli-Arab reconciliation has been the religious aspect. So as a consequence, I think what you'll find among the younger generation in all countries in the Middle East is a much greater level of indifference towards the Israeli situation. So for them, a lot of them would look at opening, normalizing relations with Israel as like, yeah, sure, whatever, whether it happens or it doesn't happen, it's not really something that, the economic relations in the past were not strong, so it's not something they view as, Israeli economy isn't it's not the Chinese economy or the US economy where it's going to be some sort of game changer for people's day-to-day lives. So I think that for among young people, it's just mainly indifference, whereas for the older generation, that's where you see more suspicion. But as a consequence, I think you'll see, with each successive generation, this kind of coming together will be easier. I would also add to that in the Gulf countries, certainly, when it comes to relations between countries, the average person in the street, not everyone certainly, but the average person in the street is much more willing to take the lead of the country's leadership, follow the country's leadership lead when it comes to deepening bilateral relations than their counterpart would be in France or the UK or the US, where you are at the moment. And so as a consequence, if you combine general indifference to Israel with a strong push from the government, you'll probably find growing appetite for those relations, but not the sort of mania that you might be seeing from the Israeli side, where because Israel's been isolated for so long. My sense is that younger Israelis are probably quite excited about this and see an opening up and new opportunities, whereas I think it's much more indifference in the rest of the Arab world.
Interesting. Eran, mania?
Well, I think it was a very beneficial thing that a certain class of Israelis that grew up thinking about the Arabs as the enemy ended up going by the tens of thousands to the Emirates for fun. And overall, I think the long-term implications of this change are much more profound than anything we've been able to produce with the Egyptians or even with the Jordanians. I would say that the ability to sustain this benign neglect on the part of Arab partners on the Palestinian question is that we should continue intelligent conflict management. Conflict resolution is not in the cards. Abbas is ailing and unable to take great decisions. Hamas is not interested in peace with Israel. But we are left with a deterrent stick on one hand and a bunch of carrots on the other, and a policy of conflict management that does not burden our Arab peace partners with the need to confront more acute dilemmas on a daily basis. And I think that the manner in which the burst of Palestinian violence in a few weeks back was quickly squelched without an escalation speaks to this, let's say, innate commitment to conflict management, at least in the part of the Israeli professional elite. I don't want to say deep state, that's a dangerous term, but the professional military and intelligence community. Going back to your earlier question on Iran and Plan B, I would say we are talking about B, C, and D. Sanctions are tightening, and the ultimate irony of it all is that the Russians have become major contributors to Iran's distress by being simply forced to displace the Iranians in the only market Russia now has, which is China. And so the Iranian economic distress is growing in leaps and bounds. The only problem is that we never really know at which non-linear point of disruption the regime would actually come into real danger from frustrated lower class Iranians in Islam Shah who would take to the streets. We don't know. We cannot rely on this. We cannot time this to prevent the nuclear project. So Plan B, with all its important as it may be in pushing the Iranians back to a table on more reasonable terms, is just one of the set of measures. Plan C, appropriately, is reminiscent of what Prime Minister Bennett, outgoing Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, called a death by 1,000 cuts. C for cuts. Small, decisive, pinpoint actions that at least expose the Iranian leadership to the notion that they are totally naked intelligence-wise, that their project is being monitored, that their operators and key movers are being monitored, and their actions will not go without notice and without response. And down the road, and by the way, the American administration in the past is reputed to have been complicit in this type of warfare, Plan C, going back to Olympic Games, popularly known as Stuxnet. And that was the Obama administration working with Israel.
Yep.
And finally, there must be and should be a Plan D on the horizon. Because if Iran does decide to cast aside all caution and go for 94% enrichment and a reactivation of their weapon group and weapon design project, then probably the only way to stop them will be kinetic. And if the US will not do it, Israel will do it.
Understood. Eran, thank you. I have 20 more questions, but I think I should turn it over to our viewers. So please, at this point, Claire, are there questions that we can pose from members of this audience?
Yes, thank you, Jason. Our first question is from Julie Klein, and Kirsten, I'll ask it to you, but others please weigh in. Other than conversations about reliance on Russian oil, how else does current Russian behavior affect the strategic and economic outlook in the Middle East? And can we expect any change in the seeming neutrality of a number of states in the face of Russian actions?
It's a great question, and it depends on the part of the region you're looking at. So for a place like Egypt, it's as simple as population starvation. They need Russian wheat. They've got to keep that channel open. In the Gulf, it's all about Yemen. Ukraine couldn't be further from their thoughts in terms of their own foreign policy. Frankly, they did not think at the beginning that it would become such a massive global issue, truthfully. What they were looking at was that Russia has been the blockade against any new UN resolution or action in Yemen that would prevent Iran from being able to arm the Houthis for several years. Even when the Brits had the pen on a new UN resolution about 4 years ago, the Russians blocked it. They actually told the Saudis to their face, we don't know enough about what the Houthis use as weapons to say whether Iran is involved or not. So we really can't take a stand on that. I mean, it was laughable. And Russia has stuck by this kind of partnership with Iran, just you scratch your back, my back, I'll scratch yours, until the Ukraine resolution, when the UAE made a backdoor deal that if Russia would back them on a new resolution, on new language, condemning Iran's actions in Yemen and sort of allowing stronger embargoes to be moved into place, and that's all working, then the UAE would not support the resolution that condemned the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And what we're seeing now is the follow-on from that. And so if you're Saudi Arabia or you're the UAE, kinetic action, the attacks that come into your country from Yemen daily, weekly, monthly, depending on where you are far more relevant than what's happening in Eastern Europe. So until we see movement there, until we see more international action on curbing Iran's activities with regard to Yemen and with regard to the Houthis and other proxies, you're probably not going to see a switch of Gulf and Gulf alliance. They're going to play that middle road. Egypt just recently, President Sisi gave a speech this week where he talked about how strong and lovely the relationship between Egypt and Russia was, and he didn't even mention Ukraine except to say something about how dialogue is important on all sides. The kinds of statements every head of state makes when they don't want to say anything sensitive. But these countries have interests that they think far outweigh either their relationship with NATO or their interests in Eastern Europe, where they don't frankly think they have that many foreign policy interests. So either they're looking for international action on their files, on the portfolios that mean something to them, in exchange for them to become more activist on it, or they're going to stay kind of riding that fence for a while.
Let me pick up on this, and I'm wondering also, Kirsten, about what Russia's military effectiveness or lack of military effectiveness in many cases has demonstrated, and what impact that might have on future weapons sales, on regard for the Russian military as a partner for countries in the Gulf and elsewhere.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. You're seeing kind of both sides of the coin. One of the reasons Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman from Saudi is going to Turkey is to discuss purchase of the Bayraktar drones from Turkey. This company is owned by Erdogan's son-in-law, and it's been lauded as this weapon of choice in the Ukraine war. I wrote an article a while ago about how it was not particularly effective. It's slow, it's small, it can't carry much of a payload. It's just that at the time, if Russia is moving, you can use it. Once Russia sets up and turns on its electronic warfare devices, they're taking these things down all the time.
Also very affordable too, I think.
Very affordable, but they're not all that good. They're only good. You're not going to take out a tank or an armored convoy or a building with them. It's same with the Switchblades that we're sending over. They're anti-personnel drones. So some of them are effective for little things. They're not going to change the game. They're not going to give Ukraine the battlefield edge or anything like that. But you are seeing Saudi say, well, Turkey's becoming a center of drone expertise. We are in a drone war in Saudi with the Houthis, with things coming in also from Iraq. So we want to, make friends with Turkey and benefit from that R&D that the government is putting into this company that's owned by Erdogan's son-in-law, and see if we can get some of that goodness out of there. But what we're also seeing, I wrote an article on this even more recently about how Russia is not the partner of choice that the Gulf has been planning on it being, now that we've seen the Ukraine war, because they were counting on it kind of filling the gap in terms of provision of arms that the U.S. was unwilling to do. There's a big debate within the U.S. government that's centered in the Political Military Affairs Bureau at the State Department about who we will sell which weapons. We had a letter written by 7 of our embassies, career ambassadors, back to the State Department saying, if we don't start moving foreign military sales along, we are losing influence by the day, trying to push their own headquarters into moving some of these arms sales. But while we have not been moving them, these Gulf partners have been looking to Russia and China to fill that gap in purchasing. But now you're not going to see Russia having resources to put into innovation, R&D. All of their bandwidth is going to go into rebuilding their own military readiness. They're not going to have it to spare on partners like they might have before. So it's not a good bet. And I hope that in the Gulf, they're kind of rethinking that posture. We'll see.
Thank you, Kirsten. Claire, I'm conscious of the clock here, so I'm sorry this is going so long. We really could go on for another hour, but please, is there another question we can squeeze in here?
Yes, just one more. Fred King in Atlanta is asking, during this visit, the president and his Israeli, Indian, and Emirati counterparts will meet to discuss shared challenges and opportunities. What role can the U.S. continue to play in helping forge or build upon these supporting and outside links to the Abraham Accords? And Omar, let's start with you.
Well, so I think that the single most effective step that the US could take to encourage expansion of the Abraham Accords is to support the two-state solution to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. I think that's the sticking point. That would get rid of, the overwhelming majority of opposition. The official state position of many countries in the Middle East, including Saudi Arabia, is that they want a two-state solution. And I think that that would be, and that would also be a step that would not only secure support from within the region, it would secure support from outside the region too, with many important players, including obviously the European Union, and I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that even China's position is two-state solution, although I'm not sure about that. So I would say that's the most important step the US could take. Anything else beyond that, I think it would only help at securing maybe top-down support. But if you want wide-ranging bottom-up support, grassroots support for the Abraham Accords, than two-state solution.
If I can come in on the actual question, the idea of a Western Quad, because India was mentioned in the question, the idea of a Western Quad came from India. This was not an Israeli fantasy about finding new partners. The idea of a U.S., Indian, Emirati, Israeli alignment, I wouldn't use the term alliance, came from New Delhi, and in clear context also of the Eastern Quad, Japan, Australia, the US, and India. This is a very significant recognition that the Israeli-Emirati cooperation on a broad range of issues, including strategic stabilization of the region, is let's say, a building block for regional architecture and perhaps even for global architecture. And that would be definitely an opportunity for the president to endorse at least the idea, if not any specific practical application of it, leading on to perhaps a summit at some point down the road. And on Omar's point on the two-state solution, clearly there are many Israelis who also seek to keep it alive. The only point is, given the heated political atmosphere in the run-up to a October or November election, this would be a very dangerous language for the president to use. It can easily be picked up by the present opposition to cast the government and its constituting parties as compliant and subservient to an American administration. I think this is going to be very gingerly handled. The U.S. would and has always been would voice its support of a two-state solution. So did Trump, mind you, in his famous plan. But whether this can be translated into anything more specific, probably not on this trip.
I think the administration's effort has been just to prevent further obstacles from getting in the way of a two-state solution, but not to push hard, understanding the realities. And I think that everyone understands that's where we are and where we're likely to be for some time. But let's try to lower tensions, as you were saying before, Eran. Stabilize the situation and leave open the possibility down the road, create the opportunity for the possibility down the road to be realized. Listen, I think at that point, we have had a very full discussion. We could go on for a long time. I really want to thank Kirsten and Eran and Omar for taking part in today's conversation. This latest AJC Advocacy Anywhere. And I want to thank you, the viewers, for tuning in. We're going to be recording. We have recorded this session. It will be available as well for later viewing. Clara, let me turn it back to you for a final comment.
Thank you all for today's timely and insightful conversation, and thank you to our global audience for joining us today. For those of you who want to dive into the issues we discussed, I encourage you to visit ajc.org to learn more and get involved. Thank you all again, and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.